Amazing. Okay, so it is such an honor and a real privilege for me to have this conversation with three truly extraordinary leaders who have been, as I keep saying, and just want to keep saying, in the rooms where it happened, making, helping presidents, lots of different presidents, making major, critical decisions, helping analyze important issues that relate both to the Jewish community and to America and to who we are as a country. And I was really inspired to host a President's Day event and, thinking about who should participate in this conversation on a team call with the Zioness team. And we were thinking about President's Day, and I happened to be looking at Gary's book, First Friends, which became an immediate New York Times bestseller when it came out. Gary was on every, TV network talking about this amazing book. And I'm going to ask Gary in a moment to really explain why he wrote this book, what the purpose of it was. But as the event came together and, we were able to include Ambassador Ross and Anne F. Lewis, White House Communications Director under President Clinton. As we know from the marketing for this event, Gary was in the White House Counsel's office, also under President Clinton, and has had relationships with lots of different administrations since, I think, the Kennedy administration. No, you were, no, of course not.
I was a 1-year-old.
Right, but you've known people who
the next generation
inhabited the White House, including the Kennedy family.
Gary's
bad math on my part. And Ambassador Ross, who has been part of, I don't know, I know you said the other day 4, but I feel like it's 6. I feel like you've been, since the Carter administration, working very closely on American decision-making related not only to Mideast policy, but Soviet policy, Russian policy. And, I'm going to read some quick bios for these individuals, but if I read their full bios, we'd be here really for a week. So Gary Ginsberg is an attorney who has spent his professional career at the intersection of media, law, and politics in both the US and Israel, is the author of the extraordinary New York Times bestseller, First Friends, The Powerful, Unsung, and Unelected People Who Shaped Our Presidents, also named a best book of 2021 by USA Today. Gary began his legal career as an attorney at Simpson Thacher, after which he served in the Clinton administration, the White House Counsel's office, and the US Department of Justice. He was senior editor and legal counsel of George, the magazine started by John F. Kennedy Jr., which is why I was associating him with the Kennedy family. Gary also served as senior vice president and global head of communications at SoftBank Group, as executive vice president of corporate marketing and comms at Time Warner, and as executive vice president of global marketing and corporate affairs at News Corp. Anne F. Lewis, most importantly, of course, founding board member of Zioness, has had a historic career spanning politics, policy advocacy, and academia. She served as White House Director of Communications and counselor to President Bill Clinton, and as deputy campaign manager for the Clinton-Gore reelection campaign, and served as vice president for public policy at Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as political director of the Democratic National Committee, as the national director of Americans for Democratic Action, as the political director, I already said DNC, and as chief of staff to then Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski, and later Senator Barbara Mikulski. Anne is an expert on women's rights who maintains the Anne Lewis Women's Suffrage Collection, was appointed by President Clinton as co-chair of the President's Commission on the Celebration of Women in American History, as well as the Women's Progress Commission, and she chaired the U.S. government working group for the Women 2000 Beijing +5 special session of the General Assembly. Ambassador Dennis Ross has been a leading voice guiding American foreign policy in every presidential administration since Jimmy Carter's. He served as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council senior director for the Central Region, and a year as special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. He was the U.S. point man on the Middle East peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations, and was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. A scholar and diplomat with more than 2 decades of experience in Soviet and Middle East policy, Ambassador Ross worked closely with Secretaries of State James Baker, Warren Christopher, and Madeleine Albright. He is currently counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So, wow, thank you again for being here with us. So I want to start with First Friends, and I want to ask Gary, this book really became an immediate hit, and you did this remarkable media tour. What inspired this book? How has the reception been, and what is the status of the book now? Are there any exciting developments that you can share?
Well, the reception was better than I ever expected. I was just happy to write the book, and the fact that it did well was, just gravy for me, because I loved writing the book itself. I guess the only development since the book came out was it's now been picked up by NBC Studios to be a 6-part docuseries for MSNBC, God willing, in early 2024. We're beginning production next month. It'll be 3 chapters from my book, the last 3 of Kennedy, Nixon, and Clinton, and then 3 we are developing of the 4 presidents since Clinton, or 5, I guess, but we are only considering 4. The 2 Bushes, Biden, and Obama, because Trump did not have any friends, unfortunately, for the purposes of my book, which I spent a lot of time examining. So
You say that as a joke, but you actually seriously looked into it.
I did, and I spent a lot of time talking to one of his closest aides, whom I've known from New York for a long time, and we went through a series of names over the course of about 6 months, and never really came to a decision on who that friend would be. And then this person, who will remain anonymous, called me after the book was about ready to go to press, and said, "Look, the reality is Donald doesn't have any real first friends." And I said, "Well, just give me an example of that." He said, "Well, we would go to Camp David for weekends, and he would bring friends and family up there." Now, normally presidents, and I guess Dennis and Ann can both speak to this personally, when he goes up to Camp David, you relax with friends, you sit in the cabins, you bowl, you whatever else you do at Camp David. Trump would just go sit in his cabin all day, all night, just dialing around to anonymous people around the country saying, "How am I doing?" And inevitably or invariably hearing, "You're doing great, Donald." And that was his respite. That was how he relaxed and got comfort. And it was really, I guess the shorthand is his Twitter feed, which became his first friend. So we are not including him in the 3 that we're focusing on after my book.
I mean, that makes sense. So to follow up with the book, and I want to share the reason why I was so inspired to have this conversation was because the thing that I found so fascinating about this book, and Gary, I've obviously heard you talk about the book so many times, Gary has shared that there were books about first ladies, there were books about first dogs, there were books, I've just heard you say this line so many times and it makes me laugh every time. There are so many books about who is influencing the presidents and who's in that circle of people that can have that real conversation, and nobody was actually investigating the first friends. And I also realized that a lot of times, the Jewish community talks a lot about what presidents have been friends to the Jewish community, what presidents maybe haven't been so much, what policy different presidents have taken on that we've been happy about as a community or not happy about in different periods of time. But we very infrequently looked at it from the other direction. Who are the people, who are the Jewish people in the circle, right? Whether as advisors or as friends or confidants or whatever it is, that have been able to help presidents analyze various situations in ways that could help pursue progress. And the story that you tell about President Truman is so remarkable. And when I heard it, I had never heard it before. And when I tell people it, they have never heard it before. So I was really hoping you could share a bit about that story, and obviously don't give all the details because people really need to read all the details in your book.
Okay. So the chapter is titled Beshert, actually, for Destiny.
Loves that.
And it's the story of Eddie Jacobson's extraordinary 45-year friendship with Harry Truman that in 1948 reaches its denouement. They had met in 1903 when Harry Truman was a bank teller, and Eddie Jacobson was a 16-year-old dropout from high school who was making deposits on behalf of a men's haberdashery. It's a word I've never used before I wrote this book. And they just struck up a friendship through this very simple transaction of making the deposit. They joined together in the war. Eddie becomes this, quote, crackerjack Jew who modernizes the field auxiliary unit that Truman is captaining. He makes him a lot of money. He allows Truman to really to shine in his military experience. So they go to Kansas City. They form a haberdashery together in 1920. It's successful until it fails. They then remain best friends from 1921, after the store closes, until 1948, the denouement. And I think it's the single most consequential moment when a friend influences a president on a key decision. And I actually interviewed Dennis for this chapter to understand just how important the decision of Harry Truman to be the first foreign leader to recognize the state of Israel 11 minutes after it was declared in May of 1948 was for the state of Israel and its future relations with the United States. And Dennis made it perfectly clear that it gave it a legitimacy that it otherwise would not have had. And I don't think we would have enjoyed such a strong relationship between the two countries if Truman had not made that decision. And since you don't want me to give away the details, I'll just say that but for Eddie Jacobson marching into the Oval Office on a March morning in 1948, 2 months before the British mandate was going to expire, and speak to Harry Truman in terms that no other person could have, no staffer, no other friend, except for Eddie, with his 45 years of intimate friendship and knowledge of his friend, and looking around the Oval Office and being able to figure out at a crucial moment what would turn an implacable president who did not want to deal with this issue, because he said Jesus Christ couldn't keep the Jews happy in his lifetime. How am I going to do it? He was frustrated that the Jews were hectoring him to recognize the state. Chaim Weizmann was sitting in New York waiting to come down to make the key appeal. He wouldn't see him. Eddie walks in to say, Harry, you have to see Chaim Weizmann. You have to recognize an independent Jewish state. And only because of that intervention does Harry see Chaim Weizmann 3 days later. And then, as I say, recognize the state 11 minutes after it's declared in May of 48. So it's a great story of how a friendship can have such an important effect on the nation, and in this case, in fact, on the world.
It's amazing. And obviously you can give as many details as you want, but the book is, everyone should read the book, really. I'm going to jump around between all of you. Ambassador Ross, you, in your book that I mentioned already, Doomed to Succeed, you go in real depth with every president since Truman with their policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. And you talk really extensively about the Truman administration and the way that the entire security and defense establishments were so opposed to being involved in the Middle East in the way that Truman ultimately was. You know, I guess to whatever extent you advised Gary about how big of a deal this was, can you put that into context historically, given your, immense knowledge on what was actually going on in the US government at the time?
Well, what makes the story all the more compelling is that Truman makes this decision over the opposition of the entire national security establishment. I mean, he has had a meeting 3 days before he makes this decision with the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who was the only five-star we've ever had, I think, and a hero of World War II, who actually says in the meeting to him that if you were to recognize Israel, or if you were to recognize the Jewish state, if they declare themselves, and I were to vote in the upcoming election, I wouldn't vote for you, which literally stops the meeting. And Truman says to him, I'm inclined to agree with you. Robert Lovett is there as the Undersecretary of State, and he is so disturbed by what's happened that he goes and sees Clark Clifford at his apartment that night. Clifford was in the meeting, and by the way, Marshall says, why is he here? He's a domestic counselor. Why is he here? And Truman says, because I asked him. And by the way, this domestic counselor is the only one who wrote memos during this period over 3 months. He writes 2 different memos where he makes the case against all those who are saying why this is such a terrible thing to have a Jewish state. They make arguments as if they're going to be a puppet of the communists, of the Soviets, because there's all these socialists. They say the Arabs will never sell their oil to us. And Clifford says, A, they're not communists. B, the Arabs can't drink their oil. And C, if you walk away from a commitment that you've made, no one is going to respect you. He's the only one who makes systematic arguments against all the arguments that are being arrayed. And Marshall reflects those arguments. Lovett believes in them as well, but he's disturbed by this. He thinks he can't have a breach between the Secretary of State and the president. So he goes, sees Clifford, and they work out that there'll be a recognition of the state in a political sense, but not in a legal sense. So we do declare, Truman declares 11 minutes afterwards. As I said, this is extraordinary because not only is the whole national security establishment against it, at the very moment he has our team up in New York is arguing for trusteeship at the very moment that Truman is recognizing the state. So he does something that defies all the so-called wise men. And he does it because, in no small part because he's persuaded by Chaim Weizmann. As Gary said, he doesn't see Chaim Weizmann if it isn't for Eddie Jacobson. And he is persuaded by Chaim Weizmann. And there's an exchange of letters afterwards. After Weizmann writes Truman a letter after he wins election that nobody thinks he can win. And Truman responds to the letter by saying, nobody thought you could achieve what you've achieved. And what you've achieved is, in a sense, less than what you deserve. It's really an extraordinary example of the significance of relationships, not just the Eddie Jacobson relationship, but also the relationship that Truman develops with Chaim Weizmann and his belief and respect for him.
You have to read Doomed to Succeed, everybody. I mean, you have to read both of these books. And today I told Anne she needs to write a memoir and she flatly said no, but you all are giving us so much learning in these books. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about with this event, and I don't think I'm dramatic to say, I think this is a historic conversation, because not only are you all historians in the sense that you have so much knowledge of history, you've done so much research, but you yourselves have also been in these rooms helping actually make these decisions. And so, Anne, I have so many questions for all of you. And I wanted to ask you specifically, as we're now rapidly approaching Israel's 75th birthday, this April, it will be the 75th anniversary of Israel's establishment. You were the White House Communications Director under President Clinton during Israel's 50th birthday celebration. How are you, instrumental in marking this occasion? This is an extraordinarily important and historic occasion, the 50th anniversary, the celebration of Israel's 50th birthday. Its third iteration, by the way, as the state for the Jewish people. Were you able to help guide that in any way that made the celebrations as remarkable as I hope they were?
Well, I think so. But first, I have to say thank you to Gary and to Dennis for giving the background for what I'm about to say. Very important, guys. Thanks. But yes, we're approaching the 50th anniversary. And what I remember, the first thing I remember is the good news is we already had a tent. The Clintons like to entertain. The Clintons like to bring people, and Gary will appreciate this as well, like to bring lots of people. So for the sake of the budget, it was useful when we had large events to be able to use a tent more than once. And we would have a tent around this time, which meant that we could invite, let us say, many of their friends beyond what the East Room could hold. So we're going to invite a lot of people. Now, what's the program going to be? Well, Bill Clinton, who, as we all know, has quite a few Jewish friends, has already agreed that he will accept an honorary degree from Hebrew University. So that part of it, we've got that hook as a start or kernel. But then what else should the program be? And here is where, again, I'm Director of Communications. What's the message we want to get out? Or another way to say this, how do we mark the solemnity, the importance of this occasion? How do we demonstrate the friendship and not have one speech after another, which would be deadly? And if you start inviting one leader, you're going to invite many leaders. What I thought of and what I recommended was that the program be readings from the memoirs of Harry Truman about how he recognizes the state of Israel, and a reading from the memoir of Golda Meir, how she learns, how she hears that the United States has recognized the state of Israel. So again, the event you've just heard Gary and Dennis talk about, we made the centerpiece of our program. And we had actually the other thing I should say, I asked Cynthia Ozick to read Golda Meir and she turned me down. And all the years I was at the White House, I had many people ask to be part of the program. She will be the one person who refused. But we did have, I think it was Richard Dreyfuss who read from Harry Truman's memoir, and Linda Lavin, who was on Broadway in a production. So she agreed to do Golda Meir. And again, I'm getting chills again thinking about it. It was a wonderful night. The tent was out on the White House lawn. So we had many, many people. it was appropriate that it be at that level. And best of all, we could remind ourselves of the history, the friendship, the strength of that relationship. So I guess I should say the only thing we were missing was that Eddie Jacobson couldn't be master of ceremonies. But I know he was with us in spirit.
Yes.
Did he know the impact that he made in his lifetime? He did.
He did. I mean, he was celebrated immediately afterward. And in fact, the real tragedy was that Truman wanted to take him on a trip around the world to the Vatican, to England, France, and also to go to Israel with him to see, how venerated both men were. And unfortunately, Eddie died of a heart attack about 8 months before the trip was to commence. So he couldn't be with the president to see it, but they wanted to make him an unofficial president of Israel. He was celebrated in the United States. He went over to Israel a number of times on his own to enjoy the rapturous reception that he received as a result of his intervention, because Truman made it very clear that he was the key voice in his head that convinced him to see Chaim Weizmann, that convinced him to do the declaration.
So if anybody is not sure whether one person can really change the world, it really is one of those things that, I think there are lots of examples of this, maybe it's not so many that are so stark, but it's truly incredible. So to what Anne was talking about in terms of the joy at the event of the 50th anniversary of, Israel's, the 50th Yom Ha'atzmaut. And you talked about the Clinton family and their true love for Israel. And so I wanted to ask Ambassador Ross, which presidents you feel had a really particular affinity for Israel, and, which you feel, in the many that you've worked with, which you feel maybe had less so. And, kind of a corollary to that from your experience working in all of these administrations, does it matter? Can the policy be great even without the love? Given that there's a conversation definitely throughout your book about, at some point supporting Israel goes from being potentially a political calculation to a more strategic interest, or one that really feels like a shared values interest. And I know you talk about that a lot, certainly with the current president.
Yeah. Look, it's a really interesting question, because I would say of all the people I work for, and it's not just because Ann Lewis is on this webinar, as a president, the one who had the most profound emotional connection to Israel was Clinton. And people have never really completely understood the nature of that. It's not that it was made deeper by the assassination of Rabin, although his sense of mission was made deeper because of the assassination of Rabin. But he had this intuitive, I would even say just an intuitive sense, but an instinct that we were Israel's one true friend in the world. He was against the idea of public differences with Israel, not because we would never have differences, but because he felt if you have differences with Israel and you create the image that there can be a wedge driven between the United States and Israel, it will give succor to all of Israel's enemies. It will weaken Israel's deterrent. If we want peace, if we want to prevent war, there has to be a sense that nothing will divide the US and Israel, whatever the disagreements. But he felt if you expose disagreements in public, it actually worked against our interests of promoting peace. And that was an instinct. There were times, I will tell you, once as his negotiator, I didn't get a whole lot of time off, but I took a weekend for a retreat. My synagogue had a retreat. So I went to the retreat and I'm there, and he calls me while I'm there. And the reason he calls me, I'm not going to get into all the details of who was pressing him, but he was being pressed to come down. This is when Bibi was first prime minister. He was being pressed to come down hard against Bibi publicly. And I knew immediately why he was calling me. He wanted to tell me why it was okay not to do that. And I knew it immediately. And what I told him was, look, I'm not against pressure in the right moments when in fact it's warranted. I'm against pressure when the only ones we're going to pressure are the Israelis. This is what I've always objected to. When the Israelis do something that deserves to be criticized, you need to criticize them. Now you can do it privately, and you can make it clear that in certain circumstances you go public. But public criticism, when it's only the Israelis who you criticize, it's what it does is it does exactly the opposite of what you intend. It makes the Israelis dig in more on the one hand, but even more on the other hand, it convinces the Palestinians in particular they never have to do anything. And we have been so hesitant over the years to criticize the Palestinians because they're weaker, because they're the victim. And by the way, the only thing that guarantees is that it perpetuates their strategy of being a victim. You want to end this conflict, they cannot be a victim any longer. Doesn't mean they're not a victim, doesn't mean they're not weak, but they have adopted that as a strategy. And the one thing it guarantees is it perpetuates that reality. Clinton had this ability to reach out to the Palestinians, but always put it in the context of what he viewed as being so fundamental in terms of our need to have this instinctive attachment to Israel. Now, interesting, the person I would say who I have found over the years who has the closest emotional connection to Israel is probably Biden. He has also a kind of instinctive connection to Israel. There are other presidents who have had very strong emotional ties. Ronald Reagan had a strong emotional tie that was a product of him being an Army officer during World War II, who was responsible for doing video training videos. And because in that role, he was among the first to see the films of the liberation of the death camps. And it so profoundly affected him that he kept them. He told George Shultz later on, he kept them because he felt, people wouldn't believe it otherwise. And at some point he thought there'll be those who deny it, and I want to show them what happened. It also made him feel we have this enduring obligation to the Israelis. It didn't mean that during the war in Lebanon in 1982, he didn't threaten the relationship 5 times, but he came back to his natural instincts, by 1984. And the idea of strategic cooperation with Israel, where the relationship with Israel was not just a function of values, but also of interest, that was launched by him. So he too had this emotional attachment. In his case, it was driven directly by what he saw in terms of the liberation of the death camps.
Do you feel that there are some presidents that you have been able to work better with in terms of, I know obviously it's not just about what America thinks, that there are other people, involved in trying to pursue different strategies in terms of peace there, or even just coexistence. Are there certain ways that you have been able to be more effective, or certain presidents that you've been able to be more effective with in these conversations?
Well, look, I mean, it always helps when there's a built-in instinctive
Affection.
attachment.
Yeah.
Because the way you can frame your arguments is more likely to strike a chord. Look, I have this feeling for Clinton because I was his negotiator, and people often ask me, does he always know what you're doing? I said, he always knows what I would do. He always knew what I was doing. Sometimes before I did it, sometimes after I did it. So he gave me a license. And, as a negotiator, with a license, you have a kind of authority that allows you to be much more effective. So I appreciated him the most from that standpoint. I worked with different presidents, and every president could be approached on the basis of, in a sense, who they were. Those who approached the Middle East through a lens of its being a priority, I approached one way. Those who had this instinctive attachment to Israel, it was easier to frame arguments along those lines. Someone who I think was misunderstood, at least in part, was Barack Obama. Obama did have an interesting attachment to Israel, but it was an intellectual attachment to Israel. And it was the Israel of the Labor Party. You may recall that during at one point in Cleveland, when he was running for president, he said, look, just because you support Likud doesn't mean you're a friend of Israel. And that reflected a kind of mindset of who he had been influenced by. Bibi at one point asked me a question, does Obama think he understands my politics better than I do? Which I said, well, if he does, he shouldn't. And I do think there was, he was someone who was responsive to Israel on security, but he, unlike Clinton, he actually felt public disagreements with Israel served our interests, at least in terms of reaching out to the Arabs. I wrote, Doomed to Succeed points out there are a lot of enduring assumptions about the Middle East that were just proven consistently wrong, but rarely absorbed
Yes.
in different administrations. And I would say, the difference between an Obama and Clinton was Obama was committed to Israeli security as strongly as any American president. And he doesn't get credit for that, and he deserves credit for it. But the sense that being critical of Israel in public served our interests was extremely different from where Bill Clinton came from.
Okay, we'll return to this conversation, but Gary, I want to talk about your life in politics, which, has been, you've done so many different, incredibly interesting, different political roles or political adjacent, I guess. You were a close friend and confidant of the Kennedy family. You were an attorney in President Clinton's office of White House Counsel. What are your favorite examples of the ways in which you've been able to advocate for issues that matter to you, whether issues that were good for the Jewish community in a particular way or for the country as a whole? And obviously your time in media also, feel free to reflect on that.
Well, I guess the one example of advocacy on behalf of the Jewish people would probably have occurred when I worked for Rupert Murdoch. That was, at the height of Fox News's campaign on the war on Christmas. I don't know, it's actually been resurrected in the last few years. But as one of the few Jews in the corporate structure at News Corp, I took it quite sensitively. I was very sensitive to it. And it was propounded very, very aggressively for about 3 consecutive holiday seasons. And it was accentuated by the fact that in the physical reception areas at News Corp, which encompassed, 10, 12 different floors, there were creches and trees, but no menorah. And I started to feel like it was, I started to feel quite personal about it. And so I went to Rupert and I said, listen, I want to convene a meeting where with you and Roger Ailes, where I can explain to you why this war on Christmas and why even something as simple as Christmas holiday symbolism without a menorah is hurtful to people like me who have a strong association with my religion. And he said, sure, let's do it. So I brought in 2 rabbis who sat with Rupert and Roger and myself for about 3 hours. And they went through both the history of the war on Christmas, as well as the societal implications of it. And Roger in particular, who was really the brains behind the campaign, believing that secularism had completely overtaken the religiosity of the holiday, and that basically, he was a proponent of how Henry Ford viewed it, I think, which was in, vaguely anti-Semitic terms.
Vaguely.
And I think that, well, I don't want to call Roger an anti-Semite, but I think that there were elements of it that I think were reflected in the way it was talked about on television. And so for 3 hours, they heard the history, and they heard the impact that it was having for Jews in particular. And afterward, I think Rupert was thoroughly persuaded, and the campaign stopped for the remainder of my time there, which is another 3 years. And then it really, I don't think, started again until the middle of the last decade. And unfortunately, today it is raging again, and it's unfortunate. But I guess that was one example of where I thought, I was able to actually influence a decision that had real impact.
They're profound. And now I feel like the culture wars can be exacerbated by anything. So, a small thing can set it off, and that feels like a big thing. So what's going on now, I don't know that anyone could slow the wheels, but thank you for sharing that story. I didn't know that, and I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't have known that there had been an actual intervention that had changed the course of that conversation. And thank you for doing that. And I wanted to ask you, your and Gary's former boss, President Clinton, awarded Presidential Medals of Freedom to 2 Jewish men, one posthumously, for their work fighting for the passage of groundbreaking civil rights legislation. And obviously the Jewish community talks a lot about our commitment to civil rights, our allyship, and really there are so many amazing people that we could highlight who did this work. What can you tell us specifically about Arnold Aronson and Joe Rao and their passionate commitment to the advancement of racial equality in America? And are there other trailblazing Jewish leaders that we should know about who really did the work from within the White House walls?
Well, thank you for remembering them and thinking about it. And I would say both for the importance of the work, for the heroism that they displayed, sometimes the courage they brought to this, but also as a lesson in how change happens, how you make social change. These are really important stories to know. And we should all keep in mind the background on this are the people out in the streets. It is the young people who are going to get out there and face, right, the police dogs. It is their, willingness to keep up the pressure to show what they're fighting for. But you need outside and inside, right, forces. So who do you have? In his first year as president, 1993, Bill Clinton, in his Medal of Freedom awardees, includes Joseph Rao. That's R-A-U-H, Joe Rao, a towering figure. And Joe, as a lawyer, Joe in the 50s represents people who have been accused of communism. Now, that's an act of courage if you think about what was happening then. He goes on, he represents unions, including Walter Reuther. They're leading in the fight for civil rights. And that includes the important lobbying for the Civil Rights Act. And then 1 year later comes the Voting Rights Act. So 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Further on the outside, so Joe is, again, a lawyer representing many good causes. Arnold Aronson has been, well, he worked actually with A. Philip Randolph during the war and talking about jobs and opening up jobs to Black Americans. He's at the what is then the JCPA, what is then NACRAC, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which we now think of as JCPA, oh dear, I'm getting my initials mixed up. It is now the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. It had a slightly different set of initials then. Arnold Aronson is the executive. They formed the Leadership Council for Civil Rights, which exists today as one of the strongest, most positive forces for civil rights legislation. And it forms in 1950 with Arnold Aronson moving again from the Jewish communal organizations into leadership of what is now the Leadership Conference, a coalition of civil rights organizations. They are lead lobbyists for what, again, eventually we get to with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And inside the White House, getting a little less attention, but absolutely essential, is a man named Lee White. And Lee White starts as an associate counsel for John Kennedy, then moves up, moves into the, again, as we know, becomes the Lyndon Johnson White House. He's now a counsel, special counsel, and he has the civil rights portfolio. So during the years 63, 64, 65, in the White House, that portfolio is led by a man, again, we should know more of, called Lee White. Now, it's true, he doesn't get a Medal of Freedom, but he is a character in the movie Selma. So that should count for something. But it is that combination. It is, again, the young people who are out in the street demonstrating. It is the forceful leadership of people like Joe Rao, of Arnold Aronson, who, by the way, when he works to form the Leadership Conference, is still working with A. Philip Randolph, right? In unions. And inside the White House, you've got Lee White, ready with the legislation. It is, I'm told, Lee White who suggests to Lyndon Johnson very early in this one, he's just assuming, as a year after he assumes the presidency, that he will go and give the speech in which he calls for passage of the Civil Rights Act and says, "We shall overcome."
An amazing story.
Yes.
And of course, it's not at all to minimize the activism, heroism, and sacrifice of the Black Americans who led the civil rights movement, but we are proud as a Jewish community to have played a role.
Yes.
So Anne, I want to stick with you for a moment. When we were talking about this event, you mentioned both the influence and the lack of influence of certain Jewish voices in the FDR cabinet during World War II. You mentioned specifically Sam Roseman, a judge on the New York Supreme Court who became a Roosevelt speechwriter, was so close to the president that he was traveling back and forth by train to write speeches. But in the conversations and deliberations that happened in the context of US involvement in World War II and the plight of Jews in Nazi Germany, Sam Roseman's name never really comes up. And ultimately, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who was the only Jewish cabinet member in FDR's cabinet at the time, went to the president to demand US involvement. This was in 1944, after having intentionally buried the horrible news about the Jews of Europe the year before. Not that people didn't know about it, but there were, active mechanisms within the administration, within the government, to kind of hide the extent of it to whatever extent they could, so to avoid US engagement. And it's worth noting that critics of FDR's commented frequently that he had a lot of Jewish advisors, even though Morgenthau was the only Jew in the cabinet, and referred to the New Deal as the Jew deal, which of course made the Jews who were advising the president afraid to speak up for obvious reasons. So how do you assess the role of the Jew in the room in moments like this, given the way that anti-Semitism manifests and the challenge of being seen as a Jew advocating for other Jews?
I'm a huge fan of Sam Rosenman, who, by the way, meets FDR in 1928, travels with him through his campaign for governor, goes on to be sort of an idea guy, a policy guy, and yes, very much a speechwriter, gets appointed a judge on the New York Supreme Court, would sometimes take the train from Albany to Washington to work on speeches for the president, and then go back to being a judge. It was, let us say, a certain flexibility in moving from legislative to executive branches that we would not have today. But what was fascinating, right. He finally, in 1943, concludes he can't really go on being a judge anymore. The demands on his time by FDR, who is, leading the country to war, are too great, and so he gives up being a judge. But he has been, again, doing both. So close to President Roosevelt that Roosevelt speaks towards the end that when his term is up, maybe Sam would and his wife would buy property near Hyde Park so they could go on being neighbors. And yet when I read his book, Working with Roosevelt, and again, it's a great example of how the White House worked then, how speeches were put together, how policies were made. There is no mention of what is happening to the Jews of Europe. It is not mentioned. Now, my sense is there were two things. As you say, there was considerable, visible anti-Semitism. Remember this, you have Charles Lindbergh, not long ago, that great American hero in 1940, talking about it is the Jews who want us to go to war. And so while there was, I think, self-consciousness on the part of the Jews that they don't want to be targets, they don't want to make Roosevelt's job any harder, there is also a real concern, we don't want this war to be a war for the Jews. Americans are often, as we know, conflicted about international wars, right? We like to think we are protected by these oceans. So the idea that we have gone to war in foreign countries, that we engage in these foreign conflicts, there's always a certain uneasiness. I think there was some question if we talked openly, overtly about too much about this was a war for the Jews, we would lose the kind of support we needed to keep. But there is no question that people knew what was happening, that they did not address it. And even against someone like Sam Rosenman, who was as close to FDR as he was, who was consciously Jewish as he knew himself to be, who after, in the Truman administration, it's one of those, again, very much advocating for the creation and support of the state of Israel. Nowhere in his book about working with Roosevelt does he talk about the fact that as they spoke, as they talked, millions of Jews were being murdered. Now, having said that, again, much credit both to Secretary Morgenthau and to the young men on his staff who were not, as I understand it, not Jewish, but were so horrified and offended by what they learned, that they put together and built the War Rescue Board. And so, yes, hundreds of thousands of lives were saved at the end, coming out of the Treasury Department.
And took on the State Department to do it, right, Ann?
Yes, they had to. Well, the State Department, and Dennis has had his own more recent experiences, but state historically had not been a great friend, let us just say, the Jewish people. That has changed. But certainly when you look at the 40s and 50s, there was a historic, let's say, preference for some older allies, the ones with a will.
There was a deep strain of anti-Semitism, given who actually, if you look in a sense, who these people were, where they came from, there was a very deep strain of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
You see it. I mean, it wasn't just don't do anything to upset the Germans in the 1930s. It's also consistently throughout the war as well, to send whatever Roosevelt was saying to Jewish leaders, like, Rabbi Weizmann. I mean, whatever he's saying to them, Abba Hillel Silver, they will immediately send a message out to the region that completely contradicts what he says.
So you all perfectly set me up for the next question, which is wanted to kind of go on this theme to ask Ambassador Ross about his experiences, and I'll share specifically that there is another theme from the Morgenthau FDR archives that is super relevant, that Secretary Morgenthau found out in the summer of 1943 that the State Department was intervening in decisions already made by Treasury, that where the World Jewish Congress was trying to send money to Switzerland to aid Jewish refugees. And according to the Holocaust Museum, Treasury prepared a report entitled "Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews." They argued one of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. And that's when FDR agreed to create the War Refugee Board through the Treasury Department. And so this is a long story to express that, as Ann said, the State Department has a long history of institutionalized anti-Semitism, which has affected U.S. policy in countless ways. And Ambassador Ross, you have spoken about this. You published a really remarkable op-ed in the New York Times that, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, something like that.
Never.
Whenever.
Yeah.
And when I read it, I think that my generation is so unaware of the way that anti-Semitism has manifested in this country. Siri is finding things on the web and letting me know. But you exposing that problem and the experiences that you have had as a Jewish advisor to so many presidents, as a leader within the State Department, how have you dealt with that? Where has it, affected or harmed your ability to do your job? If you could share more, and you can just Google Ambassador Dennis Ross, New York Times, anti-Semitism, you'll find the article. It is a really important read.
Look, I think that when I first came into the Defense Department, which was August of 1977, what I found was a kind of assumption that if you were Jewish, you couldn't work on the Middle East. If you came out of the oil industry, or if you came out of the missionary movement, you were an expert on the Middle East. But if you were Jewish, by definition, you were seen as being biased. And it was in the State Department. I wasn't there. I started in the Pentagon. It is interesting that many of the Jewish State Department officials, Foreign Service officers, would end up they would be put on the Taiwanese desk. They would be on South Africa. They wouldn't put them in the Near East Affairs Bureau. It began to change when George Shultz became the Secretary of State, because Shultz mandated that anybody who wanted to rise in the Near East Affairs Bureau, they had to be in a position where they served on both the Israeli desk and the and different Arab desks within it. It was less, I would say, probably less identifying Jewish Foreign Service officers, and more anybody who worked on Israel was then sort of shunted off to go work on Taiwan or South Africa, as if Israel was being put in the same boat. And what you had with Shultz was Shultz really changed that. Now, when I became under Baker, interestingly enough, Jim Baker, I was sort of put in charge of the peace issues, I put together a team. And I didn't put together a team. I didn't look at their ethnicity. I looked at who I felt were experts, by the way, not necessarily experts who agreed with me, but they happened to be Jewish. So you went in the State Department, you went from being in a situation where being Jewish and working on this issue was really kind of frowned upon to suddenly, here was a team that was pretty much made up of Jewish experts who happened to be Jewish, but were experts on the Middle East. So it really, it really reflected a kind of interesting change. I will say this, I want to add one other thing. So I had a senior position in the State Department at the time. And in fact, actually, when I was the negotiator in the Clinton administration, I had someone doing a security background check on someone I knew, and so I was a reference. So they came to talk to me, and the guy goes through his questions, and I'm pretty used to them because I've obviously had many such conversations. And finally, he says at one point, "Can this person be loyal to the United States, given the fact that he seems to have a connection to Israel?" And I said, "Why do you ask that question?" And he kind of looked at me and was like, "Oh," you could see him sort of thinking, "Uh-oh, he must be Jewish." And I've gotten in trouble. So I said, I mean, he's pausing. I said, "No, really, why do you ask that question?" And he's still kind of hesitating. And so I said, "So if this person was of Italian extraction," it was obvious that the guy's name had a Jewish name. And so he projects this. I said, "If this was someone who was Italian, would you say, can they not work on Italy? Could they not be trusted as an American loyal to this country?" And it was just so clear to me that if it was anybody else, this was a typical question. This was seen as being a legitimate question for anybody who was Jewish. And, that was in the mid 1990s. So their old habits die hard. And I had enough experience with it that, that's actually why I wrote that article, because in some ways it never completely disappeared.
Do you feel that it's significantly better now, or the challenge is still there?
Yeah, no, I think it has changed because, you've had so many people who are Jewish in senior positions, but they're still, dig a little deep and you'll find there still is a kind of presumption there. I think, as I said, old habits die hard, and the only way you deal with them is by constantly exposing them.
Yeah. I have so many more questions. I hope it's okay if we go a few over the hour. Do you guys have to jump? No. Ambassador Ross is like, yes. I
got a little bit more time, not a lot more time.
Okay, I know you just got back from Saudi Arabia, and I actually wanted to ask you about that. I want to just quickly ask Gary, who I know hasn't spoken for a little while. Gary, you've had such an amazing career in media, and you've been referred to, I know you already mentioned a bit about your relationship with the Murdochs. You've been referred to as something of a Murdoch whisperer, and your relationships have allowed you to create opportunities for politicians you believed in to access massive platforms and through which they could tell their stories and share their visions. And, what stories are you able to share from this part of your professional life? And I know you wanted to speak specifically about the Clintons and the Obamas and how that connected with your relationship with Mr. Murdoch.
Well, yeah, I think one of the reasons why Rupert wanted to hire me in 1998 was in part because I was relatively liberal. I was basically a moderate Democrat, but I had worked for Bill Clinton. I had worked with John Kennedy, and he didn't have anybody like that in his inner circle. And I think he was looking for a different point of view from that which he received from his closest aides. And so, although he called me the resident Trotskyite as kind of a shorthand for that description, I think he welcomed me introducing him to people that he otherwise would never have met. And one of the first people one of the first persons who really he wanted to meet and who wanted to meet him was Bill Clinton. They had no relationship in the 8 years that Clinton was president. Obviously, Fox News, which started in 1996, was a huge opponent of his and really drove its ratings higher during the impeachment struggle. The Post was no friend. I don't think any of the newspapers, even in London, were very favorable. But Clinton was smart enough when he moved to New York to realize that it made sense to become friendly, or at least friendlier with this powerful media person. And he reached out to me to kind of broker our first meeting. And Rupert and I went up to have lunch with Clinton at his Harlem office. This was in, I think, 2001. And they immediately clicked, shockingly, for two people with completely different backgrounds, sensibilities, points of view. They really bonded. They were both very curious, inquisitive people, worldly. And we spent 3 hours at that lunch. And from that was forged actually a pretty strong relationship that lasted for about 7 years, that included a relationship that I helped forge with Hillary Clinton. We had a fundraiser for her in 2006. We endorsed her for her reelection campaign for the Senate. She was smart enough to ask me not to let this news get out during the campaign itself, and it's never been exposed that we had a fundraiser for her at News Corp. But I think by that point, Rupert was pretty comfortable with Democrats. We had actually forged a pretty close relationship with Al Gore. It was primarily commercial because we owned DirecTV. Gore was starting Current, which was a cable channel that existed for about 10 years from 2006 to 2016. And we gave it life really through my introducing Rupert to Gore and they forging a real friendship. And both Gore and Clinton came to our offsite in 2006, which was really remarkable for a News Corp offsite to have these two Democratic politicians. But in 2008, he got really interested in Barack Obama. And Obama was smart enough to realize that if he could get the endorsement of Rupert Murdoch, he would be able to attract a lot of independent voters and some of the more moderate Republican voters. And so he was quite assiduous in trying to court Rupert at the same time that Rupert was really interested in forging a relationship with Obama. And the truth was that Rupert had never had a friendship with a president. He started really in the United States in the Reagan administration. Reagan had no need for him. Neither did Bush. Clinton, no relationship, as I said. And George W. Bush really had a relationship with Roger Ailes and didn't feel a need to have a relationship with Rupert. So now it's 2008. And he sees this dynamic young politician and he thinks, I can have the same relationship with him that I had with Tony Blair in 1996 in London. And that allowed Rupert to get a lot of very significant business concessions from the ultimate government that was led by Tony Blair in the years that followed his election. And so the Sun endorsed Tony Blair in 1996 and it led to his election. And I think Rupert saw the potential to do the same thing with Barack Obama, to be a kingmaker. So we had one meeting in person, and then Rupert had a series of meetings, very much off the record, never exposed before, where they talked on successive Sunday nights in the summer of 2008. And I think Rupert was very close to an endorsement of Barack Obama in 2008. And but for a couple of events that I won't get into the details of, I think he would have done that. And I think history could have been different because I don't think you would have had the Tea Party. I don't think you would have seen Fox News turn so virulently anti-Obama as early as the spring of 2009. And perhaps we could have had a more bipartisan country, a less divided country than we did. But it was, for me, it was a lot of fun to, although it didn't ultimately have a happy ending. It was for me a rewarding experience in the role I played.
Unbelievable, Gary. Like actually unbelievable. And again, more stuff. I think we're making news here tonight at Zioness, because I don't think a lot of people know these stories, and it's just to even imagine what the world could have been for me is incredible and fascinating. So I'll do one more question for Ambassador Ross and then have Anne close with a question that I really want to ask her. Ambassador Ross, in Doomed to Succeed, really, I can't emphasize how much everybody needs to read this book if you're a history nerd and you want to understand different administrations' policies toward Israel and the Middle East. There are two people that you've talked about, not extensively, but whose names come up. And so one was Mike Feldman under both JFK and LBJ, and then also Arthur Goldberg in the lead up to the 6-Day War. And I'll kind of set the scene just a little bit and then ask you to expound on it. There's a scene that you talk about in the book where Arthur Goldberg, who was the American ambassador to the UN at the time, tells Abu Iban not to rely on a commitment that President Johnson had just made to Abu Iban in Washington. Can you talk about that and whether that was like a climactic moment, whether is that like a moment in history, or is it just a thing that happened that ultimately didn't really change the course of events?
It really doesn't change the course of events, but I'll explain what it was. So when Abu Iban comes to see the president, you have to understand that on the background, on May 15th, the Egyptians, Nasser began moving Egyptian military divisions into the Sinai. And eventually he will put 6 divisions on Israel's border. Israel has always had a small standing army because if it had a large standing army, it wouldn't have an economy. You know, you mobilize, you keep a small number of active forces, relatively small number of active forces. And if you're facing a war, you mobilize the whole country. So with 6 divisions on the border, Israel would have to have its forces always mobilized and would have no economy. That's not tenable. The Egyptians basically then closed down the Straits of Tiran. So they are reversing what was the status quo that was created after the Suez War, meaning you were able to build up the port at Eilat because the Straits of Tiran were not blockaded. And you also didn't have Egyptian forces in the Sinai. You had the UN emergency forces. We had made commitments, and Eisenhower had made commitments to the Israelis that they would have the right of self-defense if the Straits of Tiran were ever closed, and we would endeavor to keep this as an international waterway open. The first thing is the Johnson administration had no record of these commitments, which is itself extraordinary because Eisenhower, in the book he wrote called Waging Peace, which came out in November 1966, had included the aid memoir that included these 2 commitments in the appendices of the book. But the State Department couldn't find any record. The White House couldn't find any record. So Walt Rostow, who's then the National Security Advisor, is sent to Gettysburg to ask Eisenhower, did we make these commitments? And Eisenhower says, yeah, we made these commitments. So now he's got these commitments, and yet, you know, how's he live up to them? Nobody in the administration wants to live up to them. To be fair, this is not a function of anti-Semitism or even anti-Israelism. It's a function of Vietnam. We have 550,000 forces in Vietnam. The Pentagon wants nothing to do with this. The State Department is not enthusiastic in any case because they're worried that this is going to cost us with the Arabs. Johnson has an emotional attachment to Israel too. If you look at the history of those presidents who had it, he does. He has an aunt who was a member of the Zionist Organization of America. He does a lot to get Jewish refugees into Texas through Galveston during the war. So he has a personal commitment. He goes to Dachau in June of 1945. He feels this stuff, but he's also dealing with Vietnam, and he's dealing with the fact that the Congress at this point isn't about to accept very much of anything from him. And so he tells Abu Iban that in response, he can tell his cabinet, he can tell the prime minister when Iban says, can I say that you will do all you can to open the Straits of Tiran, to end the closure of the Straits. And he says to him, I will do everything consistent with my constitutional responsibilities and our constitutional processes to do that, which is, by the way, a qualifier, because he's saying, I can't do it on my own. He tells them, we have to do a UN process. I have to do all this. I can't do it on my own. He says, I'm not a mouse. I'm not a coward, but I have I have to follow this. But I will do it consistent with the constitutional processes, which implies he has to go to the Congress. So Eben goes, he goes to New York the next day on his way back to Israel, and he sees Arthur Goldberg, and he says, look, this is what I got from the president. And Goldberg tells him, you got nothing. He can't act on it. He needs a resolution from the Congress to do this, and there's no way he can get that resolution. And you owe it to your government and the prime minister to tell them that.
And does that relate ultimately to Israel doing a preemptive strike on the Egyptian military instead
No,
of?
it's not the key to it. You know, the key to it is on June 1, Moshe Dayan joins the government, and then you create a national unity government. You know, what Eben has learned is that you can't count on this American commitment. But you know, we asked the Israelis starting on May 17th to give us 48 hours before they do anything. And in effect, you know, we have Israelis who are digging trenches around cities in anticipation of this. We have the Israelis creating mass cemeteries in anticipation. The military is in a different place. They're much more confident about what's going to happen. But in, you know, what you had with Levi Eshkol was he remembered 1956 when the Eisenhower administration threatened sanctions against Israel. And he doesn't want to recreate that. So he wants to show the Johnson himself and the Johnson administration, Israel has gone the extra mile to try to be responsive, you know, to what the US asks. And in the end, what happens is that he feels he runs out, he does what he can to try to persuade the United States. Sooner or later, what happens is the Israeli public becomes very concerned and creates pressure for him to broaden the government. Once that's done, then you basically have the steps that lead to the preemption. I'm going to move because my battery's about to run out.
Last question, and thank you. I'm sorry I'm holding you over here. Last question is for Anne. Anne, you have had 2 offices in the White House, and I don't even know how many other offices. And you always have with you a photo of Anne Frank. Why do you have that photo, and how do you respond to questions about it?
I have the photo because that was my name. I grew up with the name Anne Frank. So the book is published, and the story explodes, if you will, the name explodes, and unlearn that there was this little girl. And I learn and conclude that America saved my life. Now, the American military also saved my life. I am a huge fan, anywhere I can, right, to support the military and the parades, and I love it all. But I know something else beyond that, which is, therefore, I have a responsibility to my country, and then to be the best, right, citizen American that I can, but also to do what I can for other children, especially Jewish children, to see that they have a safe place. And of course, that begins with a Jewish state. So I bring Anne Frank with me because she reminds me of my responsibility, but also I love it when people ask me because I want to tell them the story. I want to remind them we all have this responsibility. You know, however we grew up, we have a country that has given us every opportunity to succeed. We can make it, how do we make it stronger? And then how do we reach out and include more people? And that's why I bring the book.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you all. And it is such a reminder. I mean, imagine if Anne Frank could see that there was another Anne Frank of about the same age who was the White House communications director, leading in all the ways that you've led, seeing, you know, Gary and Dennis, who I'm not comfortable calling Dennis, but the leadership of Jews.
My name.
I know, but you're Ambassador Russ.
I'm Dennis.
You're not all, you know, of titular, you know, anyway, it's amazing, you know, when I think about the way that Jews have been able to advance progress, given the positions that some of us have been in, and thinking about the fact that there's never actually been a Jewish president, even though so many people think Jews control the government, it's amazing to see that this tiny community has been able to impact our country in such profound ways. So thank you for being with us, for everything that you do, most importantly, for sharing. I just got a text message, Zioness makes news, Hills had a fundraiser at Fox. So we'll see this in the media.
No headlines, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to the Q&A, but there's just so much to talk about. And happy President's Day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.